This is the last meeting for this semester for E4Dev, so please stay tuned to your emails because we're going to need help picking a day of the week that fits as many people's schedule as possible for next semester. I'm going to let Zach give a brief announcement before I introduce him.
Hi everyone, I'm Zack Accardi. I'm part of E4Dev, and I'm one of two people, the other being Lily, who is sitting over there, who've been working to put together a course to happen here. It's going to be 4 days long over IAP. And we're going to be taking a lot of the content that we've talked about over this past semester and try and package it in a way that's accessible to people who don't have as much of like a really strong energy background as most of the people here, but also hopefully incorporating some new content that will be interesting to you guys. So Lily talked, I'll give a summary of the class at the last meeting, so I won't go into too much detail. I want to focus a little bit more on the project component of the class, which is something that I think might be of more interest to everybody. But a very brief overview is the class is going to be divided into kind of it's 3-hour sessions for the first 3 days, each of which is going to have kind of a primary like lecture and content piece, and then more of an active like direct engagement like activity in the second half. And there's going to be kind of an overview of energy access, what it means, and kind of the global state of energy access, a very short survey of kind of energy technologies to introduce people, again, who don't have as much familiarity. And that's going to be kind of the core of the first day. The second day is going to be focused on the interaction of energy and all of the other aspects of society that we care about, so agriculture, health, water, education, etc. And then the third day is going to be focused on financing energy access projects and different business models. So each day is going to have a couple of case studies. We want to get people to come in who are practitioners who have experience doing this stuff on the ground. And then, as I said, the kind of activity portion. So the project is one of the things that we're really, really excited about. And what we're going to be doing is developing evaluation strategies, project evaluation strategies for actual practicing energy access entrepreneurs, and that's going to be something that's facilitated by a project evaluation workshop. It's going to be hosted by the Poverty Action Lab, as well as some direct interaction with the practitioners that we're going to bring in to help out with these projects. So we're going to have a survey going out to talk, to get feedback about E4Dev over the semester in general. One of those questions is about the IAP course and whether you're interested in getting involved or participating rather. You can also just email us directly. So talk to me afterwards if you're interested, or we'll also have in the next email going out contact information. So talk to me if you have any questions.
Also, really quickly, just to add to Zach's point, which is about IAP, one of our E4Dev advisors and probably someone who's been helping Zach and Lily quite a bit is Professor Ignacio Arriaga, who is joining us this evening. It's a rare occasion that he's here, so we just wanted to acknowledge him and say thank you for all your support.
I just wanted to quickly thank everyone for kind of supporting us in this, what started out as a bit of an experiment to see if people besides Sarah and I were just interested in this. We're interested in this, and I think we've proven that a lot of people really are. So thanks for coming out all semester. And I want to thank Vivek for taking on the last talk of the semester. Vivek is a PhD candidate and researcher in the Engineering Systems Division, and he's also a fellow in the Tata Center for Technology and Design.
Thank you. My name is Vivek. I'm in the Engineering Systems Division. And how many of you are energy people, scholars, practitioners? How many of you wear the energy hat mostly? Okay. And how many of you wear a water hat? Okay. great. So I hope there'll be something for each of the communities here tonight. And this talk is about thinking about how to design large desalination projects in many parts of the world, in some developing countries. But I'll focus on the developing world first before talking about the large desalination part, just to set the stage. And as we know, and as the professors in the room will tell you, learning is maximized when there are quizzes and questions in the class. So I have some questions for you. If you have questions for me, don't hold back. Here's the first one. Okay, no consulting the interweb. What's 1 cubic meter of water or anything? C? Any other takers? All three of them, that's right. So just keep this in mind. So a cubic meter, you could think of it in a variety of ways, but it's going to come up a lot in the charts and graphs. So it's important to understand what that really means as you think about these issues. So why is desalination a big deal? Especially when you see articles like this in the New York Times, with Spain's desalination ambitions unraveled. So this is one of Europe's largest desalination plants at Torrevieja, which is almost idle. It's only been supplying about 20% of its capacity over the last year or so of operation. And it's been there for about 6 years. And to give you an idea, the capacity is about 250,000 cubic meters per day. And it runs mostly on electricity, but it's not completely connected to the grid. So this begs the question of why do we need these large desalination facilities? So the premise here was that in the early 2000s, when a lot of these projects were planned, that this part of the world would see a lot of economic development, which means people would come into this part of the country, live in those very nice condos that are coming up along the coast. Water demand would go up, so there was a demand forecast, but that didn't materialize with the economic situation in Spain today. And so this plant is mostly a stranded asset. It doesn't have to be, but given the other socioeconomic factors like subsidies for water, subsidies for energy, the water output from this plant is quite expensive, and getting farmers, other industrial and commercial users in that particular part of the country to pay for this water can be challenging. So how do you reconcile this image with the forecast for the growth in desalination that's expected over the next few years and even beyond 2016, on the order of millions of cubic meters a day of production capacity? And not just in the developing world, but also in the United States and Australia, in Israel, including countries like India, Oman, and Qatar. So there's a lot of speculation, but there's also a lot of positive push in this industry. So there's a disconnect here, which was interesting to me, so I tried to unpack it a little bit. Here's your second quiz. So some of you may have seen the World Health Organization statistics. What's the average personal daily requirement, minimum requirement for survival? Gallons or liters? Any units?
5 gallons, like 2 gallons?
5 liters. So some of you were close. And what's the minimum per day if you include all the personal activities that you might consider inside the home as a domestic consumer of water?
200 gallons.
That might be a little high. It's 13 gallons. But here's some comparison. The average person in the US uses about 65 to 80 gallons, which is under 300 liters a day. In the Netherlands, where they actually have plenty of water, in fact, they might have too much water, is about 27 gallons. And then Gambia, I believe, is the lowest LCD rating with about 1.2 gallons, which is less than the minimum for survival. And this variation shows up a lot if you look at the available renewable resources per capita by region. So you'll see that some parts of the world, like Australia and New Zealand, which have large land tracts, but maybe fewer people, have a lot of water per individual. And North America is pretty high up there. So one argument is, we have water, let's use it. Parts of the world like South Asia and the Middle East may not have that facility. But also if you look at, of those people and of those resources, which parts of the world would draw from renewable resources the available water? And regions of the world like the Middle East and South Asia show up, and this chart is almost flipped for that purpose. So some of this can be attributed to the natural variabilities. So this chart shows precipitation and variability. So on the horizontal axis is the normalized average precipitation. So this is basically taking precipitation in each country and trying to turn that into an index so it's comparable across the nations. And on the vertical is a variability index, which tries to capture the amount of annual variation in these resources. So you'll see in the top left, where you have low precipitation but high variability, those regions and those countries of the world are particularly at risk of water scarcity and water stress. And you'll find some developed countries up here, like Australia, and even parts of Europe, like Greece and Spain. The United States is down here for reference. And so the focus when it comes to technologies like desalination tends to be in those parts of the world where you have low precipitation, high variability, to account for water gaps. So one of the questions that you might ask is, well, in some senses, this is a natural resource endowment. And so just like some countries have oil, some countries have other commodities. So if you have it, you should use it. And if you don't, you should take that into account in structuring your economic sectors and activities. But the relationship between economic growth in a nation and its water consumption is sort of established depending on how you slice the numbers. That particular trend might look different, but the idea is that, for example, in Ethiopia, from a recent study done here at the Joint Program, there was an elasticity of 0.1, which means that if you reduce the water available to something like the agricultural sector by 20%, that shows up for about 2% of GDP loss in terms of the opportunity cost to the economic activity. So even in countries where the water endowment, so to speak, is not large, those countries in the spirit of economic development might still be very interested in pursuing ways to make water available and used in the various economic sectors. So focusing again on the Middle East, which tends to be a water scarce and stressed region, you'll see that the forecast and the projections for decreasing water availability shows many of those countries in red here. And then on the right is basically the relation or the comparison of water withdrawals in relation to the available renewable water in those nations. So you'll see Iraq here, which actually has a fair amount of renewable water supply. So renewable here, again, is precipitation that gets stored in reservoirs and basins, and it's available for withdrawal. And then at the top, countries like Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, where they don't have a lot of renewable water capacity, so they have fossil water or shallow groundwater deposits, but still extract a fair bit of that water for agriculture particularly. And for potable water and industrial water use, the demand gap is filled by desalination. In Saudi Arabia, that number happens to be 50% of all potable water withdrawals come from desalination. So it's a big economic sector, and desalination as an infrastructure sector, and there are many nations that will continue to pursue that. So coming back to Cambridge, where does Cambridge get its water from?
Quabbin Reservoir.
Which one? Quabbin, not that one.
Fresh Pond.
Fresh Pond,
Yeah.
okay. How much does it cost?
150
$150 what?
dollars
Per?
cubed meter.
Nice try. So here's the water source map for the city of Cambridge. So it does come from a fresh pond, but fresh pond is the terminal reservoir, which is a glacial kettle which means it was a naturally occurring reservoir there that they used for storing water to supply Cambridge. But most of the water, the precipitation and the drainage happens in the Hotspur and the Stony Brook basins, that reservoirs that drain through these aqueducts, which are supported in part by distribution lines to drain the fresh pond, and that's where you get your water from. So now I'm going to date myself. For those of you who were here 5 years ago, we had a water main burst, I think, across the river. And the entire city of Boston did have water for 2 days. But Cambridge had water because Boston gets its water from a different reservoir, which is Quabbin. So here are the costs. If you look at your water bill, now most of us in Cambridge don't get a water bill because the regulations say that our landlords pay for water. So very few of us actually pay for water unless you own your own home. But if you look at the bill that your landlord gets, you'll see units like CCF, which is 100 cubic feet. And if you convert that to metric units, cubic meters, the number that you get is $1 per cubic meter, which is $1 per 1,000 liters of water. So it's very cheap, as Alex said. Now, how does this compare? So one tension that you'll notice in this type of activity is the tension between the cost to make water available, the price that consumers get charged for water, and then the social value of that water. And sometimes there's not enough parity between these to set the incentives right or to optimally procure water resources. So what is the price of potable water, so the bottled water that you might be drinking now? How much do you spend on water when you buy it at the store?
$1 a liter.
$1 a liter. That is right. So here's the bottled water price comparison for a number of countries. So on the bottom is California tap water. This is a 2003 number, so it's probably gone up since then. But that's 50 cents a cubic meter. So that's very, very low. And here it's $1,000 per cubic meter, so that's $1 a liter. But if you look at countries like India and Nepal, it can be quite expensive in comparison to what you get out of the tap here. So one reason why this could be important is because there's often this consideration of what's the price to heat while delivering potable water from something like desalination. And often bottled water is a proxy in terms of thinking of health benefits and other benefits from having access to clean drinking water and sanitation facilities.
So all of these are tap, except for the first one.
All of these are bottled,
Yeah, all of these
except,
bottles,
right, except for the first one. Okay, well, so this was a bit of a primer on some of the water and economic issues having to do with water. So I'm going to jump into desalination unless anyone has a burning question.
Can I ask you one?
Yeah.
So bottled water price, that's going to include distribution, which isn't necessarily true for like shipping stuff to a pipe. Like it seems like these are two different ways to get water to people.
Yeah.
How does that factor in when you're comparing like bottled water versus desalinated water?
So those tap water numbers also include the costs of distribution facilities, so the pipelines that you have to lay under the road. So those tend to be pretty large numbers too, but they get spread out over a lot of users. You could think about, you could do a back of the envelope calculation in terms of the fuel required to drive the truck to deliver the water, and look at the supply chain. So that makes it very expensive, but you'll be surprised if you run some of the numbers in places like Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan, where I've had the opportunity to do some work recently. People pay almost as much as bottled water or higher, even for tanker water that comes from an already so it comes from a desalination plant, so an already treated source, into their residential tanks. So the the value that people attribute to potable water might be much, much higher even than what shows up in the bottled water calculations. So as a comparison, some of the numbers in desalination are between $1 to $4 a cubic meter. And that depends on the energy sources, the size of the facility, the location, the variability of demand. So I got into the topic of desalination because of a project that we have here at MIT under the Center for Complex Engineering Systems with the CACS Research Center in Saudi Arabia, which is their equivalent of the NSF. So parts of, as you can see in this Google map image, Saudi Arabia is a very arid place. And the chart on the left there shows that in many parts of the country, especially in Mecca and Medina, which are the places of pilgrimage, almost all of the water, 100% of it, might come from desalination. So this is a very large economic activity in Saudi Arabia. and of great concern to policymakers there. And so one of the projects that we have with them and have to spend time there and understand better is how they approach the design of their desalination facilities. So if you look at desalination globally, one thing you quickly realize is that a particular technology appears to dominate, and that's reverse osmosis. So those of you that were here for David's talk a couple of weeks ago may have learned something about this. But there seems to be a lot of, many installations of these other technologies like multi-stage flash and multi-effect distillation. But if you unpack that picture a little bit more, you'll see that most of those happen to be in the Middle East. So flash and distillation, these are thermal processes, whereas reverse osmosis is a mechanical process. And depending on what the energy inputs, you consider, particularly oil, fuel, heavy fuel oil, and gas, which tend to be available locally in the Middle East and at very subsidized prices, that might be one of the factors that drives the selection of that particular technology in that part of the world. But actually, there's a fair number of reverse osmosis installations even in the Middle East, so that doesn't really explain the whole picture. So here's just a quick overview of multi-stage flash. The reason it's called flash is because you heat salt water and it passes through a series of tubes and compartments in this large industrial facility, and when it comes into contact with certain surfaces and in certain compartments, it evaporates and then condenses in a collector that you can pump out the condensed water, which is your highly potable water. And the concentrations there tend to be less than 25 parts per million, so it's very, very pure in that sense. Multi-effect distillation is similar. Instead of stages, you call them effects, but the overall process is the same. You supply heat through steam most of the time, and the feed water gets raised in temperature and then condenses in different parts. And you might pump that either through pipelines or store it on site. So here's a picture of one of the big multi-effect distillation units at the Fujairah site in the UAE. And it's large, so they had to build that barge specifically to be able to transport that unit. Yeah?
Don't you lose minerals when you condensate the water?
You do, and some of those, so I don't understand the chemistry very well, but some of those are okay to lose, like boron and selenium, and some of those in some concentrations you might want to retain. So typically what's done is you mix the desalinated water in with relatively clean groundwater, so that you equilibrate those concentrations. Yeah. It's a great question. And reverse osmosis, which is a mechanical pressure-based technology, basically takes the seed water, uses some chemicals to treat that, and then pushes that through a filter, essentially a membrane. And because the membrane, the porosity and the permeability is so low, most of the solids and the particulates stay on one side of the membrane, and the cleaner water passes through, and then you pump that out. So this is the 2S plant in Singapore made by a company called Hyflux, which won the Project Management Award of the year, I think in 2011, for a very unique design in how they integrated a power plant into their desalination facility on the tiny island of Singapore. And Singapore has a very interesting water history if you've read about that part of the world in its contracts with Malaysia and Indonesia. So another important aspect of delivering these large industrial facilities is the contract structure, the project organization that you use. And so you might be familiar with terms like EPC, which is essentially a public sector purchasing an infrastructure asset. So basically writing a check to a construction company saying, here are the specifications, in 5 years, turn this particular facility over to us. In contrast with something like a public-private partnership, where the public sector utility might enter into a contract with the construction company or the developer of this facility to say, all we need is water. We don't really care so much about the design, and so we won't specify particularly what technology you have to use or how you have to lay out the plant. But we just need assurance and reliability of X cubic meters of water a day, and the incentives get written into the contract. So you could observe that since the late 1990s, which is when privatization really started to pick up in other utility sectors like electricity and telecom, it did start to make some inroads into water as well, but a little later in those sectors. And most of the plants that began to be delivered under reverse osmosis tend to be under public-private partnerships tend to be reverse osmosis plants. And I'm still trying to understand if there's something particularly about reverse osmosis that makes it better suited to private sector involvement than others. For example, you could speculate that the vendors that deliver that technology have a slightly different industrial structure than the companies that, like Bechtel or Doosan from Korea, that builds MSF and MED plants. So for those of you that are interested particularly in the energy issues, so here are some numbers from a very interesting paper by Afrin Siddiqui and Baladias Anadon, who's at the Belfer Center at Harvard, and they looked at the water energy nexus in the Middle East and North Africa. And so here are some of the cost and energy consumption ranges that they came up with. So this chart shows electricity consumption, so where the treatment process used fossil fuel, they converted that number into the electricity equivalent in kilowatt hours. And so you'll see at the bottom is abstraction, which means getting the water out of the ground or from a reservoir. And at the top is disposal, which means treatment or discharge of various types. And then many of the treatment processes in the center are the desalination processes, which tend to have very variable ranges, but also on average much higher energy consumption per cubic meter of water. So in terms of environmental impact, for every cubic meter of water that you want to produce from a distillation process, you need 3 to 4 times as much source water. And the rest of that is discharged into the environment as brine. For RO, those numbers are a lot smaller. And so this is just an interesting thing to keep in mind, as if you're building a desalination facility on the coast, that's a good thing. But if you're building an inland desalination facility for brackish groundwater, the reservoir has to support that kind of withdrawal to be able to generate potable water for use in a city or an urban area.
Vivek?
Yeah.
What are the common environmental impacts for putting that much brine, like A, on land and then B, into the ocean?
So I think that's a great question. I don't know too much about the marine impact. One issue that you might be familiar with from the recent news is algal blooms in terms of decreased salinity and decreased concentrations. But then reef damage is pretty common, and loss of certain species, I would suspect, is also something that people might be concerned about. I just don't understand a lot of that and haven't looked into that particularly. But what I did find was some interesting statistics on what the amounts of discharge are. So the chart on the top left shows a location of the large desalination facilities around the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf, depending on which country you're from. You might have a different name for it. And the chart on the bottom left shows the anti-scalant loads. So anti-scalants are the chemicals that you would put into the water before it enters into the distillation or pressure-based process, so that the dissolved solids in the water don't scale the metal and other components and don't corrode those components. And that's on the order of 60,000 kilograms a day that's discharged into the Gulf. And on the right, you have at the top chlorine and copper. And I didn't know that copper was such an issue until I found this image. But chlorine is on the order of 20,000 kilograms a day. So those are pretty large numbers in terms of the chemicals that are discharged into the ocean there. So this is again a second slice, but still a broader overview. So as you start to think about the design of a particular facility, two of the things that affect the costs of facilities are the water quality of the feed water and then also the capacity of the facility, as you might imagine. So here's a chart that compares the TDS concentrations for the various oceans where you might want to install a desalination facility and some of the temperature ranges. So those are probably the two most important factors in terms of designing the facility. And typically you design it for worst case. So you would be very conservative and you would design for the top of the range. So this chart shows the unit cost, so dollars in terms of cubic meters a day of capacity in terms of the desalination facility. And on the very left, the column shows brackish water and inland water, which has the mid-range of TDS. So you could take that as a benchmark or a reference. And then if you looked at brine or highly concentrated seawater, you'd see that the cost per unit in terms of production capacity moves up. But if it's river water or low concentrations of saline water, cost might come down. So these charts show some of the probability distributions and what you'd expect in those unit cost numbers. And this analysis looks at 7,000 projects. But I do some more detailed statistical work on the same data set, so I'll show you some more of those results. In terms of plant output capacity, I was interested in understanding what the average plant size was over time. So I looked at plants starting in 1980 until basically today, what's being built today. And I started to see this trend where the variances in plant sizes is still pretty high, but the means start to go up. So plants today tend to be built to meet very large demand considerations. For example, the plant in Spain and the plant that was just completed this year in Adelaide is expected to support about 25% of Adelaide's water demand, which is, I'm not entirely sure what those numbers are, but it's a very large plant. So this is again looking at capacity cost over time. So one reason for looking at this might be learning effects. So with any capital-intensive technology, you might expect that as you build more of that and you do some more R&D into it, you'd be able to drive the cost down. But interestingly, if anything, those numbers start to converge across the technologies in this particular data set. So I wasn't able to find a learning effect in terms of, since 1980, if costs have been driven down. Yeah, Jesse?
This is a logarithmic scale, right? So this is
Yeah.
a huge 10x range that you're showing. What accounts for such variance in costs?
So a lot of it has to do with pumping systems, intake systems, and output systems. So there's the unit itself, which can be relatively standardized, but then there are all the other supporting systems that have to be integrated to the plant to make it a fully functioning facility, including any distribution piping to connect it to the main. So I suspect that a lot of that gets counted in. So any learning effects that you might see at the unit level might be rounded out or get offset by very specialized pumping systems. So actually there are maybe on the order of only 3 or 4 companies globally that build the high pressure pumping systems for these facilities. Yeah.
Do you think the earlier ones just were easier wins? So like, could you control for the quality of water at each of these plants and perhaps kind of tease out
Proximity to source water?
Yes, so I tried to do that in the next analysis, so I'll show you that. So, but before that, I was also trying to understand more about whether a particular contract mode or particular delivery structure in terms of degree of privatization affects costs. But the ranges, as you, again, in log scale here as well, are quite large, so very large variances here. But the means, I mean, they're basically comparable. Like, I wouldn't make any claims based on this analysis. But it's still interesting to have done and observed. So here's some of the analysis that I was trying to do. So basically, I looked at aggregate plant costs, so not dollars per cubic meter, but plant cost, and regress that again in log scales on plant capacity and also input water quality. And those 2 variables alone explain about almost 95% of the variation in the data. So those are very good predictors of what the capital cost of these facilities will be. And the way to read this is that, so this is linear life. So typically when you're looking at some of these facilities, any production facility like a manufacturing plant or a power plant, you might have a production function that looks like plant cost times some, which is some coefficient times the capacity of the facility raised to some exponent, right? And so this is empirically determined, and for every industry or every context that you might be interested in looking at, you want to figure out what a specific A is and what a specific alpha is. So the A here in logs is this intercept, and the alphas for each of these curves is down here. And the implication of that is that with a very high alpha, so if you're at 1, it means a constant returns, so you have almost no economies of scale, which means you can just have a linear fit, a linear function, and that would determine your capital cost. But if it's closer to 0.7 or 0.8, you have aggressive economies of scale, which means the larger the facility you build, the more you'll save per unit of production capacity. And so with numbers like 0.9, it turns out that there's not large economies of scale in these facilities, and this is consistent with the literature in the last 10 years that looked at on the order of 300 plants. I just looked at a lot more plants. So what do I do with this kind of information? So I built a simulation model, and basically I use some exogenous inputs like water demand, water quality variation, and temperature distributions, and then volatile energy inputs in what I call an uncertainty simulator, and feed that into a design choice interface. So this interface basically allows me to select MSF or MED or RO as a technology. It allows me to pick continuously a variable in terms of the capacity. So I could pick very small plants or plants as large as 200 or 300,000 cubic meters a day. And then also layer on top of that a certain type of contract formulation. And I could use this to understand which plants would be expected to be more valuable over their lifetime. So this chart shows project value measured in terms of NPV using a Monte Carlo simulation of about 10,000 runs. So on the vertical axis is NPV, which is a discounted cash flow analysis. And on the horizontal axis is design capacity, going from 5 to about 45 million cubic meters a year. And the first thing that comes, and so the three different charts are different contract structures. And the first thing that you might notice is that project value appears to peak under any of these considerations, irrespective of the technology. And the intuition behind that is if you build the plant too small, there is a lot of money left on the table. So demand is available, you're just not meeting that demand. And if you were to have a slightly larger plant, you would get some more revenues from meeting that demand, and you could improve the value of this infrastructure project, right? But you get to a certain hump where you basically size the plant to a certain level, and then every marginal addition in terms of capacity there changes your cost structure so that you're not recovering as much from meeting demand. And also beyond that level, demand is getting more variable. So in your uncertainty distributions are getting wider over time in your Monte Carlo simulation, which is what leads to this type of curve. The second thing that you will observe is that no technology dominates. So you would have to look at a contract structure in relationship with a particular level of production capacity faced with a certain uncertain demand profile to understand which technology is right for the particular circumstances. So this is basically a way to unpack how to go about selecting the technology and how to size the plant capacity. So if I were to fix the plant size, say I'm only interested in a plant, I understand very well what my demand's going to be, so I fix plant capacity, but I'm just interested in looking at the effect of different contract structures. So again, here this is about net present value, but that's on the horizontal axis. And this is a PDF, so the vertical axis is just frequencies of the realizations. And you have the three different technologies for the same capacity. And you'll see that under some contract structures like take or pay, the spreads change. So the value distribution might shift depending on how you pay for the water that's produced in which particular demand scenarios. And this can be particularly important if you're a large industrial consumer entering into a contract with some private developer to say, I'm going to purchase water from you under certain demand considerations, and at all other times, I'm just going to draw water from the city taps. And so that can affect the value of the project and the return to the private developer, and might change their investment considerations.
Vivek?
Yeah.
Can you please explain again what take or pay is?
Sure. So take or pay, I'll do it in the previous, thanks for that question, I glossed over it. So I'll explain all three contract structures. So the first one is a volumetric charge. Volumetric charge is just a price per unit. So if I consume 10 cubic meters, there's a fixed price here, $1.10, and that's what I get. In a cost, or in a capacity plus volumetric charge, I pay for some portion of the capital expense. So I know that this entity is going to be spending a lot of money to build this facility, so I reimburse a certain part of their capital expense, and then pay a slightly reduced price per unit of consumption, right? So that just changes the payment structure in a particular way. And then take or pay up to a certain demand level. So I should say below a certain demand level, if water demand falls too much, then I want to penalize the public sector or the party at the other end of the contract for not allocating enough demand because I've already incurred all these capital expenses in building this facility. So there's a certain price that I get per available unit of capacity anyway, and that number can be changed. So you could do a sensitivity analysis to say, what if that number is 30% or 50% or 60%? And then for every other unit of demand that you actually meet, you have a fixed price similar to a volumetric contract. So these types of contracts are starting to become common in desalination, but they are much more common in commodities, especially natural gas. Okay, well, so that was a lot, and so I think we're getting close to the end of the hour here. So I'll pause there to answer any questions in helping summarize some outcomes or takeaways from this work. And then I also have a video to show you about a new solar desalination plant that's being conceptualized off the coast of Saudi Arabia. But if there are any other questions, I'll take those before going to that video. Yeah, Alex.
How do you determine the value of the contracts? Is it the difference between revenues and price or costs, or is it considering like the foregone consumption at the cost of bottled water?
So I have a number of different ways of thinking about that. So a straight cash flow analysis is basically just the difference between the revenues and the costs. But that tends to be a little arbitrary in terms of how I would determine what the price, the revenue is. Typically in water utilities, the payment structure is fixed in a way that reimburses costs, and you might have some kind of increasing block tariff like the one I showed for the city of Cambridge. But if you bring in some economic theory and you have some kind of inverse demand function that says the further away, the larger the gap between the installed capacity and the realized demand, the larger that price should be. And so I've started to build in some of that. So what that ends up doing though is it's supposed to capture the opportunity cost of not meeting demand. So it should basically say, in terms of the GDP losses that I was talking about earlier, this price is representative of what that value loss would be. And so by looking at the area under that curve, you could say, here's the welfare loss to this region or the society by not meeting demand. But in coming up with good numbers for that, that's pretty problematic, and there's lots of complex assumptions that you have to make there, so I'm still working on some of that. For now, these results only show very simplistic assumptions. Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about the optimal plant size, sort of improving technology, sort of reducing energy, and mostly kind of in the context of Saudi Arabia or Singapore. So I guess I'm wondering, in sort of a developing world context, which countries could actually pursue desalination? Why would they want to pursue desalination sort of as an H2O solution? Or is this really something that's happening in really wealthy countries? Is this an option outside of countries that have GDP that are OECD countries, basically?
Yeah, it's definitely an option. What it depends on, though, in developing countries is the opportunity cost of other sources of water. So I think David showed you a slide from the 2030 Water Group report, which was this increasing marginal cost curve of basically what would it cost you to get water from water efficiency, and then what are the other infrastructure solutions, and then desalination was at the very end is a very expensive chunk. So that's certainly true. Desalination is a very expensive infrastructure solution. But in parts of the world, like the Middle East, many of those countries are not OECD level countries, right? So those countries can still think about investing in desalination.
But
India
would you call
has-
those developing countries?
No, well, it depends on, I mean, that you could call them low to middle income or middle to higher income countries, but I think the solution is, can be considered across a whole range of countries. So there's African countries that are considering it. I think Kenya is considering building desalination facilities by tapping geothermal heat. I mean, I'm not being very precise about which countries I call developing or not. I just think it's being considered globally.
So you were talking about before, there's kind of a geographic difference in the type of technology used and the size of the plants. And I'm wondering if you've looked at whether there's a geographic difference in the types of contracts that are pursued and whether that's kind of a confounding variable in the previous classification.
So there's a higher correlation between the type of contracts and where the incidence of new capacity installations are, and many of those just tend to be in the Middle East because that's where most of the desalination capacity is. And so I don't think it's confounding in that sense, but there just aren't that many instances of different contract forms being used outside of the Middle East relative to the number of installations. So Australia has some very large plants that are being delivered under public-private partnerships. So the Victoria plant is one that was built in 2010, I think, and the Adelaide plant is one that was completed this year. And then the rest of those that are being done under privatization schemes are mostly in the Middle East, the big either independent water power plants or just independent water plants. And there's one in California that's being done by the company called Desalination, which is quite a large plant that also has a water purchase agreement. But I don't think that really shows up in the data.
If most of the plants are in the Middle East, then when you do a correlation, how would you see a lot of variance? Because a lot of them have similar energy prices, they have similar feed water qualities. So is that taking out a lot and therefore giving us a really good fit with, say, a lot of the things we regress?
Yeah, so what I showed you was aggregate global regression, basically. So you could do the same for the Middle East. And the cost numbers that I showed you were capital numbers, right? So it's basically the cost of construction and steel and input materials. So it doesn't really capture the energy information in terms of subsidized energy and all of that. So that's one reason why you wouldn't try to do that regression on a cost per cubic meter produced, because that number collapses all the various factors. So it's much harder to get reliable operating cost numbers. And so I've been trying to track some of that down, but I just haven't seen those yet.
Yeah, because what we should see from an engineering perspective is where you have low energy costs, the capital costs should be lower as well. So
why is that?
Well, if you have a very low energy cost, then you build a very inefficient system. And so you end up with lower capital costs. Whereas if you have very high energy costs, you need to build a very efficient system, and that demands a very big system that's expensive. So, I mean, I don't really know what the actual correlation is when you look at the data, but certainly as an engineer, you always hope for that trade-off.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, yes, I understand the intuition, but just keeping in mind that you would have to control for technology type, year of build, the demand that's actually allocated to the facility obscures a lot of that. So it's just harder to hypothesize that, I think, after looking at some of these numbers.
So we're probably going to just have time for one more question, because I know Vivek wants to sort of this really cool solar desalination technology. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Sweet. So maybe just one more question here.
It's a low impact question.
Low impact question. Let's go with high impact.
So I guess similar to the learning kind of curve question, if you're just looking at capital costs, then you're going to lose out any efficiency improvements that have taken place. And I assume that there have been significant improvements in especially RO efficiency over time. So rather than using cost per cubic meter, which will take all those other confounding variables in there, can you just look at a learning curve of capital cost to efficiency ratios to see if progress is being made?
Yeah, you could.
That is.
You could. I haven't had any data
on efficiencies.
On efficiencies. So that's what I'm trying to express, is that it's much easier to come across the build numbers. So what did the government pay to have this facility done, as opposed to what's it costing them to run it year on year over the life. And so that's been hard to come by.
All right. Cue it up.
All right. Thanks. So I'll just leave it playing and hang out at the back in case people have questions. It's pretty self-explanatory.
How much land area is this requiring?
It's like 20 acres or something.
Huh, I'm sorry?
20 acres or something. So this is the really surprising part. Because there's a continental shelf, we need about a 6-kilometer water intake system. And this is what sometimes obscures what the content of one of these, there's some of these outliers.
What is it sitting next to there? The oil facility, or?
So it's sitting next to an old multi-stage flash facility that's run by the Saline Water Conversion Corporation, which is the state desalination company of Saudi Arabia. So this plant has been designed at the pilot scale, so it's about 30,000 cubic meters a day, which is not very small, but Saudi Arabia has a lot of experience and they understand the particular site conditions very well because they're already running a plant there. So they were able to go with a large plant. And this video doesn't really explain a lot about the energy system, but it does a better job of giving an overview of the reverse osmosis system.
I mean, suffice to say, it looks like a lot of energy use. Like,
Yeah.
Where does that, it's solar, right? Where does the solar come, like where does the energy?
So they're planning to build a CSP plant right next to it.
Okay.
So they're probably going to do something like the Ivanpah facility in just about 100 miles west of Vegas. But they're also looking at the linear Fresnel lens combination.
Are they using the heat and electricity from CSP, or?
Mostly heat. They're going to use the heat for treating some of the water that goes to the multi-stage flash facility right next door, and then any energy output that they get from electricity, they're going to use to power the RO pumps. They're probably also going to need a grid connection. Basically, here the grid is, there's the plant next door is like a cogeneration facility, so it's just a power plant that's a few kilometers away.
So it'll run off the grid at night?
What's that?
Will it run off the grid at night?
Yeah.
So you can use the waste heat output for flash systems?
Yeah.
How many megs does this hold, you know? Do you have any idea of the scale of the electricity consumption? Because that seems enormous.
I think the plant
To think
they're
about that.
trying to size is about 9 megawatts.
Oh, that's tiny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but compared to this thing, I think, that, yeah, this thing must be bigger than mine.
Oh, yeah, it's easy to
Massive.
Well, this is just a desalination facility. This
Yeah.
is not even the power plant.
No, but how much electricity would
Yeah, that's what it is,
Yes, they're building a 9 megawatt facility.
And that's going to run net all of it, or, I mean, it's going to pull from the grid too, so,
Yeah, so at night they'll pull from the cogen.
but that's the capacity required is only about 9 megawatts?
I think so. That's
Not very
well.
much.
I think,
Yeah, that seems really
I think that covers up to 60%. So they might, if they run at a full capacity, they might need more electricity.
So smaller than I would have thought. Maybe the facility is smaller than it looks.
cool.
All right, well, that's the end of it.
All right. You guys, thank you guys so much. This has been an incredible year, just as Yael said. We have one really quick announcement, Angie.
Oh, yeah. So Monday, our newsletter will most likely contain a survey. Please fill it out so that next semester we can upgrade what we had from this semester and make it better and more convenient, hopefully. Look out for that.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys.